Imagine your job is to step, day after day, into rooms where death is already seated in the corner, patient and unblinking. You open a door, and the air changes, sour with fever, heavy with vinegar and smoke. You know that odds are poor, that the coins you earn can't buy you certainty, yet you walk in anyway. In the Middle Ages, they had a name for this profession, a role so close to the grave that some swore it smelled of it: the plague doctor. If you had lived in 14th century Europe, there is a chance that the last knock at your door would have come from a figure in a waxed cloak and a long curved beak. He would stand in your threshold like an omen pulled from a nightmare, lenses where eyes should be, a leather bill packed with herbs to tame the stench. For some, he was the final hope. For others, the first clear sign that hope was already losing. Either way, when he crossed your floorboards, your house fell silent, as if even the walls held their breath. Tonight, we will follow the people behind that mask, who they were, what they believed, and why the costume that promised safety so often failed to keep its bargain. We'll learn how they worked, why neighbors watched them like walking ghosts, and what it cost to tally the living and the dead. It is not a tale of monsters, but of ordinary men pressed against extraordinary terror, acting with the tools and knowledge their age could afford. But to grasp why this may have been the worst job in the medieval world, we have to feel the world it moved through. The cobbles slick with ash and rain, the bells that never seemed to stop tolling, the narrow alleys where rumor ran faster than medicine. Come closer, not to the bed itself just yet, but to the street outside, where the day thins and the city holds its breath, and a black figure begins his rounds. When evening thins to a cool veil, the city changes its voice. Smoke drifts low from 100 small hearths, curling along narrow lanes and slipping beneath doorways as if it knows the floors by heart. The streets are hardly wider than an outstretched arm, stone pressed close to stone, balconies nearly touching, laundry lines swaying like dark ribbons. Lanterns bloom one by one, their light the color of steeped tea, leaving pockets of shadow that hold their breath between doorsteps. Stand with me at the mouth of such an alley. The air is layered, a sour edge of sickness, the briny whisper of the river, the animal fat of tallow candles, the warm crust scent of bread that someone still dared to bake. Over all of it, sharper notes: rosemary, juniper, rue, herbs bruised and packed into leather beaks, hung in sachets by windows, burned in small braziers to sweeten the faith that smoke can carry away misfortune. Vinegar rides the breeze too, a cleaner's sting rubbed into rails and latches, poured into bowls beneath bed frames, splashed across thresholds as if it could draw a boundary the pestilence would not cross. Listen a moment. Iron rims judder on cobbles. A cart rolls carefully, its axles creaking like tired knees. Far off, a bell tolls and then tolls again, slow as a heartbeat settling after a climb. From a courtyard, the soft chant of a prayer. From a shuttered inn, a whisper that frays into silence when footsteps pause outside. Dogs pace with their noses to the ground. A watchman taps his staff against the stones. 3 patient knocks to say he is there. Somewhere in the near dark, a cough catches, hesitates, and fades. The city does not sleep. It keeps a long vigil, inventorying each sound for omens. Your fingertips know this place even if your eyes are unsure. The stone of the walls sweats with the day's damp, cool against the skin like a river pebble. Door lintels are polished by generations of palms, smooth as bone. The air clings, a fine, sticky moisture that makes wool itch and hair curl. Beneath your soles, grit slides in the seams of the paving, and straw, strewn to soften the street and swallow spills, sighs underfoot. Candles gutter in the draft and steady again, their small flames bowing to movements you cannot see. Marks guide the way as surely as street signs. A chalk cross on a door, a twisted bundle of straw tied to a latch, a scrap of red cloth pinned beneath an iron nail. People have invented a language of signals so the city can speak without being overheard. Who needs bread left on the sill? Who must not be visited? Which rooms hold fever? Windows that once leaned curious into the lane now press back. Shutters sit like closed eyes. Yet beneath them, life insists. A mother hums. A boy counts coins. A brewer tilts a cask and watches the level fall, then ties it off with a tidy knot. The world does not end in a single gesture. It ebbs, then gathers itself, then ebbs again. Through this woven breath of living and fearing moves a figure in black. He is not hurrying. The hem of his coat is stiff with wax and dust. The leather of his gloves creaks when he tightens his grip on the handle of his cane. The mask lengthens his face into a bird's profile, a quiet silhouette against the lantern light. Up close, there is another layer of scent. Crushed lavender in the beak, vinegar dampening the lining, a smear of resin at the seams. He brings a pocketbook and a pencil, little tablets of knowledge in a city of rumor. He is watched from windows and from cracks in shutters, eyes following him like shadows that have learned to move. He stops at a door marked with a faint streak of ash. He raps once and then again, not to alarm, but to be heard through the thickness of wood and worry. A latch lifts. He speaks softly, and the words, though you cannot catch them, carry the steadiness of a practiced ritual. He is fear and hope bound into one body. For those inside, he is the possibility of guidance, or at least of being seen. For those outside, he is a reminder that the city is one long corridor, and each room is closer than it seems. Step back for a breath and notice what the light is doing. In the alley's throat, a lantern paints an oval on wet stone. Along the balcony rail, a wick trembles and throws threads of gold into the dark. The moon is a thin coin parked in the corner of the sky. Somewhere the sky opens, and a slow shore breeze finds its way up from the water, cool and salt bright, nudging ashes and lifting the edges of hanging cloth. The city smells cleaner for a heartbeat, and then the mixture returns, familiar now, as if the nose has learned its grammar. Not all doors open to sorrow. In one window, a woman pins clean linen to a line by the stove, its heat-breathing bread and faint sweetness into the room. In another, a scribe tilts his page toward the candle and coaxes his letters along the margin, copying a remedy that may be no better than a prayer. The apothecary's shop is a small theater of color, even at dusk. Glass jars with round bellies, powders like crushed sunsets, oils that catch the light and hold it. He measures carefully, not only out of habit, but to give weight to the act of care itself. This is the world the plague doctor walks, and it is not only affliction. It is habit and hope, ritual and rumor, neighbors who leave a loaf on a sill and pretend not to see who takes it. It is the cold solace of stone and the warm touch of cloth, the rasp of rope, the music of iron on stone, the dull, steady courage of those who carry water, sweep steps, boil vinegar, walk their small rounds, because each small round still matters. Walk a little further. The lane opens into a square, where the church stands like a patient animal, stone flanks warm from the day. The bell rope sways. and the bell sounds again, round and deep. A cart waits beneath a canvas, and a man with a ledger holds his quill at the ready, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in concentration. The doctor speaks with him quietly. They count, they consider, they nod. The work is method, even when outcome is uncertain. Then the figure in black moves on, the soft thud of his cane setting a pace the city seems to match. You began at the edge of the alley, with the day's smoke on your tongue, and without noticing, you have crossed its threshold. The glass of your window became a warped pane of leaded light. The hiss of a distant engine turned to the clop of hooves and the tug of a cart. Your doorknob has the cool weight of iron. This is how the past receives us, not with a single leap, but with a series of small, familiar exchanges. Here, in this evening-lit city, the plague doctor is not yet a symbol on a museum placard. He is a neighbor at work, and the work draws him now to the next door, where a lantern waits and the world narrows to a room. He had practiced fastening the mask by lamplight the night before, hands careful and slow, as if tying a knot in time might change its shape. Now, at the threshold of his first house call, the straps bite with a quiet insistence at the crown of his head and under his ears. The beak tilts his vision by a fraction, framing the world into a narrow corridor of glass and leather. He inhales, and the world arrives through filters: rosemary and rue, lavender and vinegar, a small garden pressed into a bird's skull. The scent is meant to be courage. It is, at the very least, something he can hold in his lungs when words will not settle there. His name is Thomas, though the city will learn to call him other things: crow, beak, omen, names that belong to a silhouette, not a person. This morning he is still Thomas, a young physician whose books smell of oil and dust, whose hands remember the weight of apricots from his mother's market stall as easily as the weight of an anatomy text. He was not the most promising student, yet he had a way of listening to a pulse as if it were a story that would confess its plot if given time. When the magistrates came to the guild hall with their offer, he didn't feel brave. He felt chosen by process, by the slow arithmetic of a city running out of names on its volunteer list. The stipend would pay his brother's debts. The contract included lodging and fuel for a brazier. The terms were simple, as the most terrible bargains often are. In the mirror's soot-dark oval, he tests his voice. The mask throws his words back to him, muffled, as if spoken from the bottom of a jar. "Good morning," he says, and the sound is not his. "How are you feeling?" he tries, and the glass eyes offer no reply. He thinks of the first day in the lecture hall, when a cadaver's hand was uncovered with ceremony, the professor's voice even and tender. "We must learn how to look," the professor had said. Thomas did not know then that learning to look would one day mean learning what others saw when they looked at him, a shape that meant the worst had arrived. The cane is light in his grip, wood polished to a soft sheen by someone else's years. They told him it served two purposes: distance and direction. He could lift a chin with it, move a blanket, point where he needed a window opened or a basin set down. The point was to touch less with hands and more with intention. They had a phrase for it at the guild: prudent proximity, as if one could legislate the space between hope and harm. He carries also a leather satchel with the instruments that make sense of his calling: a small knife, a wax candle, a sheaf of paper folded into quarters, a horn spoon, vials with labels he's copied himself in neat small letters: oxymel, theriac, rosewater. He believes in them the way a sailor believes in a charm nailed to the mast. They are not the wind, but they keep the hands busy and the heart steady. Before he lifts his cane to tap the first door, fear visits him with the clarity of cold water. It isn't fear of death. Not exactly. The mind is poor at imagining its own absence. It is fear of becoming a sign. He imagines the whispers in a lane as he passes. That house next, then ours. He imagines being watched and avoided, wanted and hated in the same breath. He thinks of his mother's voice the evening he told her, how she smoothed her apron and did not cry, how she set 2 cups on the table and said, "Then remember to eat and to speak gently." The counsel of those who love you is always practical. It trusts you to find your own courage. He taps the door twice. A pause. Once more. The latch lifts, and a woman peers through the smallest crack a hinge can allow. She is younger than the voice he had heard through the wood. Fear is an old voice in any throat. She looks at the beak first, then at the lenses, then at the gloved hands. Her eyes flicker with the mental act of replacing a person with a function, as one would replace the name of a neighbor with the number of a house. She opens the door further, and he steps into a room that has made itself neat for him. A basin ready, a stool, a bundle of clean linen, a small cup of vinegar like a candle to ward off storm. Care survives in the rituals of arrangement. On the bed, a boy lies, watching the ceiling, as if tracking a moth. His hair is damp, his lips dry. Thomas counts without counting, the rise and fall, the small swallow. He wants to say his name, "I'm Thomas." And then he remembers the way names can anchor and pull. He chooses the neutral, the professional. "Good morning. I am the physician." The word physician means nothing and everything. It is a promise to look, to measure, to stay. He kneels to the boy's eye level, the beak making a careful arc. The mother sets the basin at his feet, and he sees the carefulness of it all. A floor scrubbed 2 hours ago, a sheet freshly turned. He asks the simple questions and listens to answers made of air and hope. When did the fever begin? Has there been vomiting? Any swellings in the groin, under the arms? The mother's hands open and close as if kneading. Thomas lifts his cane and indicates the window. The mother unlatches it, and the room collects a ribbon of outside that smells like rain and iron. He opens his pocketbook and notes the boy's age, the day's date, the 2 or 3 signs he has learned to mark with small marks, as if the act of notation could tilt the balance of the unseen. The boy's pulse tells its quick, shy story under Thomas's glove. The swellings are there, tense little stones under skin. He asks to see the linens, and they are bright, a good sign, then not meaningful, then still something to hold on to. He sets a cloth, vinegar damp, upon the boy's brow, aware of the long tradition of such acts. Water on brow, oil on brow, hands on brow. Humans trying to cool or bless or draw fever off by the very will of touch. Inside the mask, breath beads the lenses, and then clears. A small weather he must learn to navigate. He thinks of the treatises, of the humors, of the invisible airs. He thinks of his teacher's voice saying, "The physician's art is not omnipotent. It is a lantern brought close to a problem." He chooses words with care for the mother who is watching as if he were kneeling not by her child, but at the edge of a cliff she must step along. He does not say plague. He says, "A serious fever," and "I will return," and "Keep the window open to let the air move." The instructions are humble daughters of what little is known. Move air, cleanse surfaces, steep herbs, rest. He leaves a small paper with a mixture to be washed and warmed, and another with the shape of the day. When to sip, when to remove, when to try again. When he stands, the room tilts, not from illness, but from the sudden awareness of his height in the doorway, the way the beak protrudes into the domestic geometry. The boy watches him as one watches a comet, something that belongs to a pattern you don't understand but must accept. There is a place in the boy's gaze that makes Thomas wish the mask were transparent. He wants to show a face, not an emblem. He inclines his head, an old, ordinary gesture that persists even when the face cannot. And the mother copies it, and in that small exchange, the room feels less like a ship in rough water and more like a place with a table and a stove. Outside, the alley lets him go like a thought given back to itself. Each house has its own weather, each door its own gravity. He records the address in his pocketbook, and beside it a mark that he has invented this morning for watch closely, a small circle with a dot inside. He will learn a new alphabet before summer is over, one made of strokes that only he can read and that no one will ever ask to see, because the tale they tell is too local, too daily to be worth saving. Yet he will keep it, because writing is a way to ask the world to hold still for a moment. The second house teaches him another lesson about the mask. Children throw pebbles at shadows because pebbles are small things one can control. As he lifts the latch, a little boy in the courtyard points and whispers to his sister, who gathers her doll closer. The grandmother watches from the doorway, hand at her throat. When Thomas turns, intending to nod, the grandmother takes half a step back and steadies herself against the jamb. He understands then that he can enter a room in silence, and yet his presence will speak first and loudest. He slows his movements. He folds into smaller shapes. He uses the cane to indicate, to ask, to promise space. He becomes a careful creature, not quite human in outline, attempting human gentleness. This family has wrapped their daughter's swelling with a strip of linen tied like a sailor's knot. He loosens it with the cane's tip and says, "You did well," because praise is healing when very little else is. He shows them how to steep rosemary in vinegar and how to wash the edges of a sore without angering it. The father stands with his hands on his belt, listening like a man learning the steps to a dance he will soon perform alone. Thomas is aware, with a sudden, almost comic ache, that he has not eaten. He drinks from the cup of vinegar and water they offer. It puckers his mouth and lights his eyes. The girl watches his eyes and smiles, and he is grateful for the moment's ridiculousness. A bird-masked man making a face like a child at a sour draft. It is possible, even now, to share a joke through glass. He walks again. The city receives him and returns him, each door a tide. There is a house where a man will not let him cross the threshold, but begs advice from the step. There is a house where a sister insists on holding the basin herself. There is a house where the only patient is fear, and he prescribes fresh air and a neighbor's company at the window. His satchel grows lighter as small packages change hands. He becomes a little better at moving without startling the very people he is trying to steady. Not braver, simply more practiced. By noon, the mask has fashioned a microclimate around his face. His cheeks are damp. His lips stick briefly to the leather when he speaks. He learns to lift the beak slightly if he wishes to be heard more clearly, to angle the lenses away from the direct glare of the street so the fog clears faster. He discovers that he can smell hunger through the herbs, that he can tell when a room has been tightly closed for days. when a broom has been leaned unused in the corner. In the afternoon, he returns to the boy from the first house. The fever still rides high. The swellings are angrier. He suggests a poultice and shows the mother how to set it, how not to fear her own hands. He writes again, slower now, as if copying from a stone tablet. On the last line, he writes, "I will come at dusk." He doesn't sign it. His hands already feel tired of his name. He wonders, as he walks, whether he helps or only counts. The pocketbook might as well be a tally for a merchant who trades in chances. He thinks of the older physician who pressed the satchel into his hands 3 days ago. "You will be useful," the man had said, and his voice made it sound like both a gift and an absolution. Useful does not mean victorious. It means present. It means that in the ledger of a neighborhood, your steps are a new column budded with small sums. Visited, washed, listened, returned. The city may measure him by other numbers, survivals, losses, but the work at his scale is granular, often invisible. He is learning to be content with that grain. Toward evening, he returns to the guild hall to refill his satchel. The room smells of ink and juniper, the safe library scent transposed onto this new geography of need. A senior practitioner is there, feet up on a stool, mask lifted to his forehead like a visor. His hair is damp with the day. "How many houses?" he asks, not unkindly. Thomas tells him. The man nods, as if tallying a harvest. "You'll learn to pace," he says. "Drink more. Sit when you can. You're no use if you fall over." The humor is dry and keeps panic at arm's length. It is a doorstop for the mind. He lifts his mask for a moment to eat bread. The air on his face feels indecent, like stepping out of a church into sunlight. He chews slowly and is grateful for the plain sustenance. He thinks of his mother again, of her instruction to speak gently, and realizes that the gentleness is for himself as much as for the patients. He has not wept today, and he may not for weeks, and this too will be a function of the mask. It soaks more than sweat. On his way back to the boy's house, a man calls to him from a window. "Are you the doctor?" Thomas looks up, and the beak makes the gesture sharper than it is. "Yes," he says. The man doesn't invite him in. He points to the next street over. "There's a girl there who won't ask for you. Her mother died last week. Just go." Thomas goes. The directions are as exact as a map to a church. He finds the door, taps, waits. The girl opens, a single braid down her back like a rope tying her to the room. He steps in, and the room is tidy in a way that speaks of stubbornness, not of ease. She has been doing everything she was told to do, and still the world did not keep its end of the bargain. He sits on the stool and lets his voice be the most ordinary object in the room. There are words one learns for such moments. "I am here now," and "let us see what can be done," and "you have kept her well for as long as breath allowed." He writes a few plain notes and leaves a small bundle of herbs and instructions that are less about cure than about keeping the hands moving through the long, empty hours. Sometimes usefulness looks like scaffolding around a grief so that it doesn't collapse onto the person carrying it. Dusk draws the city inward. Windows bloom warmer. The bells give up the hour with a weary sort of grace. Thomas returns to the boy, whose name he learns at last because the mother says it without intending to guard it. Bernard. And once a name is in the room, it changes the room's weight. Bernard's fever breaks into a sweat that feels like a negotiated truce. The mother's shoulders drop a fraction. Thomas knows the story is not finished. That nights unspool their own chapters. but he allows himself the smallest nod, the smallest ember of relief, careful not to cup it too hard. On his way home, he passes a group of youths with bundles of straw. They make a show of not noticing him, yet their eyes catch and hold. He wonders who he is for them. Fear, rumor, a dare. He takes the longer route to avoid the square where the cart will be at this hour. His feet ache in a clean, honest way. He is surprised to find that he hums as he walks, not from cheer, but from the mind's need to mark time with something that belongs to it. The tune is one his mother used for counting, a rhythm that stacks and steadies. In his room, he unfastens the straps in reverse order, as one might unlearn a spell. The mask comes away with a faint sigh. On the table, he sets the pocketbook, the satchel, the candle. His face in the small tin mirror is younger than the voice that spoke all day, older than the eyes that looked from behind glass. He washes his hands in water that smells faintly of his own medicines and watches the day leave them. The way the fingers relax, the way the knuckles loosen their carefulness. He writes by candlelight, not the ledger now, but a letter he may never send. Today, I learned how to take up less space so that fear could find its own place in a room, not spill into every corner. Today, I learned that a mask can be a wall and a bridge. Today, I learned that when a fever breathes, we breathe with it. That measure is a form of respect. Today, I learned that I am useful, which is smaller than heroic and better suited to the long road. Before he sleeps, he lays the mask on a folded cloth as if it were a head resting. He finds himself murmuring, "You and I will have to be kind to each other. It is absurd to address an object. It is also necessary." In the morning, he will become again the walking emblem that makes shutters tremble. People will think he writes down the names of those who will not live. Sometimes he will. But sometimes he will write down the hour a fever turned, the name of a girl who laughed at vinegar, the fact that a neighbor pointed him toward a door. He will learn to carry these notes like small, bright coins against the day's cost. Outside, the city sets its shoulder to the night. Someone pulls a blanket higher. Someone trims a wick. Someone prays without words. In a lane not far away, a bellman passes, his staff tapping gently 3 times. Thomas listens to it as if it were a promise kept. The mask is there on the cloth, a quiet instrument. He closes his eyes, not to court sleep, but to hold for a last moment the faces that looked up at glass and leather and found, somehow, a person they could meet halfway. Tomorrow, he will tap the next door, and the one after that, not because he is certain, but because uncertainty itself needs company. And in the narrow space between symbol and man, he will try to be the steady thing the room can lean on. By the end of Thomas's first week, the city had learned his outline. It did not learn his name, so much as the way light slid off the wax-heavy folds of his coat, the neat, methodical pace measured by the soft tap of his cane. He was not greeted. He was registered, like weather. Doors clicked shut a heartbeat sooner when he turned a corner. A mother gathering laundry let a sheet hang, a small flag of domestic life, then drew it in as if the night had advanced by some hours. He passed a baker's stall, and the baker, who had once joked with him about misshapen loaves, now set a small basket on a hook by the awning's post and stepped back. Payment and distance, cord and caution making a new etiquette between them. People were more afraid of the doctor than they were grateful to him. Gratitude requires a future. Fear only requires a rumor. He learned to watch how fear rearranged a street. Men who would have nodded looked away, and found their boots fascinating. Children worked out a bravery ritual. Stare, touch elbow to elbow twice for luck, dare a friend to whisper crow, then run. A wandering friar crossed himself and continued his chant a touch louder until Thomas had passed. At a fountain, women who came to draw water stood with their buckets held like shields, and a girl, bold without malice, asked the question the adults would not. Do you carry it inside the beak? Her mother hushed her with a hand, but Thomas shook his head gently, tipped the long bill to show the dry herbs within, and said in the most ordinary shop voice he could manage, "Only rosemary, little mistress, and vinegar on the cloth." The girl nodded with the grave authority of a child who has been permitted to see a trick undone. Later, when Thomas had gone, someone would say under their breath that the herbs were not to sweeten the air, but to trap the pestilence so it would not escape. That the doctor was part jailer, part priest, ministering to the demon and to the afflicted both. In the Guildhall ledger, the arrangement was simple. The magistrates had written the contract in a hand as clean as bone. A fixed stipend for the duration of the visitation, a lodging set aside near the pest house, fuel, a brazier, an allowance for vinegar and herbs, exemption from the first 3 levies of the next year in recognition of service. There was more, in smaller letters, the clauses that made the stipend feel like a sentence. He would treat no other patients until the visitation ended. He would not leave the city on pain of forfeiture. He would accept the oversight of the health wardens and render lists of houses visited, cases observed, and outcomes. He would keep to quarters assigned to him when not on rounds. He would bear his own burial costs if death was by natural cause and not on duty. The older physician had said, with the dry humor that made harsh truths palatable, "It is work, not honor. If honor comes, it comes late, and in the mouths of those who did not sign such papers. A coin placed into a palm is never just metal. Here it had the weight of a key and a chain both." To Thomas's mother, who counted his stipend against the debts that had pressed the family as constantly as a thumb presses bread dough, it sounded like reprieve. To Thomas, who felt the city's gaze slide off his human edges and settle on the mask, it resembled exile granted at home. He was paid in coin and in distance. It was not quite punishment, not exactly prestige. It was the job that money found when the better jobs shrank away. The city believed many things at once, as cities always do. A barber surgeon with clever hands could be a saint in one story and a butcher in the next. The plague doctor, this thin figure in black, became a portable theater for beliefs that needed a shape. Some said he was a priest of death, a custodian of thresholds, who knew secret prayers to ease a spirit's passage, and whose beak was an altar where herbs burned invisibly. Others called him a scavenger of misery, a man fattened on hazard pay who tallied lives like bales for the city ledger. A man hurrying past Thomas in a lane muttered, "Death's scribe," and when Thomas, startled, half turned, the man lifted a hand in apology and did not slow, as if one does not apologize to the weather, but only notes its force. The beak collected its own rituals. Some households asked him to stand in the doorway and tip it toward the bed, believing that the first inhalation through its herbs worked like a benediction. A fragrant tide pushed across the sick person's breathing. Others begged him not to lower it at all. They feared that if the beak pointed directly at a body, it called the pestilence by name. Children sketched the doctor in charcoal on walls, circle eyes, a long triangle for the bill, and then rubbed the figure out with the flat of their palms until it became a smudge, a charm against the next day's worry. A fishmonger, bravely jocular, offered Thomas a bunch of rue. "For your nose, Master Bird." Then, with a wink that was insurance against his own boldness, crossed himself 3 times. People made gestures to negotiate their helplessness. Thomas learned the map of colleagues who worked the same dark edges he did. The city had its brotherhoods of mercy, men who wore hooded habits and cinctures, and who were granted the right to pass even when other doors were closed to ordinary citizens. They moved like a tide, bearing bread, lifting the weak to litters, carrying the dead with a practiced tenderness that minimized the jostling of grief. Their mottos were simple and severe. Help at once, speak little, return. They called Thomas Doctor in a tone that sounded less like respect than like inventory. And when they were done with their tasks, they washed their hands and faces in bowls of vinegar set at the Brotherhood house door and prayed short prayers, a liturgy pared down for speed and repetition. He admired them the way a traveler admires a bridge, without romance, with gratitude. There were also the women who did the work no one named when the city was whole. Searchers, they were called in some quarters, watchers in others. Women with sharp eyes and practical hands who went door to door to record the sick, to lay linen, to make broths, to teach the quick lessons of washing and airing rooms, to report the tallies to the wardens. They spoke plainly and expected plainness in return. Write the age, one told Thomas, tapping the page with a knuckle. Because men forget ages when they are frightened. They taught him where families hid bread when they were ashamed to ask for more, which yards flooded after a night's rain, so that he could advise a patient against sleeping close to a floor. From them, he learned that the city was not an abstraction, but a body with many small, insistent minds. From the clergy, he learned another grammar of service. Priests moved through neighborhoods with a different gait. They had the right to enter rooms as a matter of course, and the obligation to do so even when it cost them. They brought oil and words that had been said in 100,000 rooms before. And sometimes that was exactly the point. Thomas would meet a priest in a doorway, and they would share a nod, like soldiers passing at the change of the watch. When their hands brushed, passing a jug of vinegar or a piece of linen, they would both feel the preposterousness of arguing whose work mattered more. There were points of friction. Processions, for example. A priest would want the city to pray together in the square, all voices toward heaven at once, and Thomas, thinking of air and bodies, would prefer candles lit in windows and prayers spoken where they stood. Sometimes the magistrates opted for spectacle, sometimes for caution, sometimes for both in perplexing sequence. The pestilence, being impartial to controversy, continued. At the apothecaries, Thomas learned the economics of fear. Prices rose like fevers in the hardest weeks, then ebbed when supply lines steadied, and the river barges brought fresh loads of vinegar, pitch, and herbs from upriver. The shop was a small republic of color. Glass bellies gleaming, powders like sunsets filtered through smoke, and the apothecary kept his scale so polished that even worry could see itself in it. "You doctors buy juniper as if it were certainty," the man said, measuring carefully. "I sell you steadiness by the ounce. It is the best I can do." When Thomas asked for a cheaper mix for a widow who had come with coins gone to the green of long use, the apothecary did not sigh or argue. He reached for a different jar, one he called comfort, and set 2 pinches on the square of paper as if adding courage to a recipe. Outside the formal channels, those who worked with death moved according to a schedule older than policy. Grave diggers, men with shoulders like door frames, sharpened their spades with the same care a tailor sharpens his scissors. Cartmen learned to wrap their hands in strips of leather because rope and sweat will flay skin as surely as any intent. They and Thomas were not friends. Friendship requires a field of shared leisure, and there was none. But they developed an efficient civility. They warned him which lanes were bad for a cart after rain. He warned them when a house had stairs too narrow to bear a body without 2 extra men. They did not share stories. They shared maps. For all this scaffolding, the dominant social fact of Thomas's work was that it changed how people used their eyes. In a normal season, your gaze floats along a street and alights on the small commerce of faces and goods. In plague time, eyes became instruments made to measure distance. People looked at Thomas to calculate how to place their bodies, their buckets, their children. If he paused at a corner to rest his shoulder a moment, a window shutter would edge closed, a tidy line drawn without anger. He understood it. He had learned to make himself smaller. He kept to the shadow side of a lane when traffic pressed so that others could keep the sun. On the rare day, he removed his mask in the Brotherhood house to drink, and someone came in unexpectedly. He could feel the air change around his bare face, as if he had wandered naked into a public square. The mask, guarded and estranged in equal measure, it filtered the air in the human arrangements that air supports. Payment arrived irregularly. The magistrates were not stingy. They were harried. Clerks fell ill. Runners were diverted. City coffers behaved like wells in a dry season. Water when you needed it most. None when you were most thirsty. Thomas learned the small humiliations of earning coin that had the scent of reluctance. A clerk counted his stipend with the weary care men give to arithmetic that makes everyone sad. "You are owed more," the clerk said once, not meeting Thomas's eyes. "You will be made whole when the city is." The city is never whole, Thomas thought, but he did not say it. He folded the coins into a kerchief and walked back to his room, thinking of bread, of fuel, of the tiny store of rosewater he allowed himself, because a life that holds one small, unnecessary sweetness is a life that recalls itself as human. He paid in other currencies. At the inn he had used to visit once a month to hear travelers tell stories, the innkeep pressed his lips together and pointed to a bench set apart near the door. "I will pour you ale," he said, "but you will drink it there." The words were not unkind. They were a boundary made visible. At the barber's, where men usually traded opinions along with hair, the chair fell silent when Thomas entered, and the barber showed him a clean basin, as if offering a private chapel. In the lane where children once played at nights, their wooden swords clacked more quietly when he walked by, and he took to angling his brim to avoid catching his own reflection in their attention. It was not all avoidance. The city had subtle ways to say thank you when it could not pronounce the word. A loaf left on a sill with a sprig of thyme tucked in. Bread and music married by a green note. A pot mended and set at his doorstep by hands that did not sign their work. A folded paper pushed under his door with a prayer copied in a child's heavy letters. "God keep the watcher of our street." Once, at dusk, a man on a ladder hanging a lantern paused and said, not looking down, My mother says you walk like a man carrying a bowl too full to spill. She says that is the right way. Thomas carried that sentence for days, as if it were a charm someone had sewn into his sleeve. Rumor had its own appetite, and sometimes it fed where Thomas's shadow fell. People said the doctors were paid each time a house was sealed, so they sealed houses gladly. People said the doctors carried small knives with which they lanced the buboes in order to harvest the poison and sell it to alchemists. People said the beaks were made from the bones of birds who fed on gallows meat. These stories were not believed by everyone. They were believed by tired minds at the end of long days, the time when a tidy narrative feels more merciful than a tangled truth. Once, in a courtyard, a man accused Thomas of bringing the pest with him, and a neighbor stepped between them, leaned on a broom as if bracing a door, and said, "He brings a pair of eyes and a pencil. Leave that be." The broom, the voice, the easy segue into talk of rent 2 minutes later. These were the city's true guards. On market days, if one can call them that when half the stalls are missing, the social arrangement rehearsed itself like a ritual. A bellman cleared space with slow taps. The Brotherhood established a small corridor for those who needed to pass without touching. The priest stood with the poor box beneath the church eave. The apothecary set his bench at the edge and aligned his jars like soldiers. Thomas stood where the health warden pointed and answered questions with patience that grew not from saintliness but from economy. A handful of clear sentences could prevent a dozen visits. "Open your shutters in the morning," he would say. "Do not sleep close to the floor if you can raise your bed, even by a hand's breadth. Wash your hands, and the places hands often go. The latch, the rail, the cup handle. If you must sit together, sit with your shoulders to the same wind, not facing one another." He did not promise safety. He promised a posture, the domestic equivalent of a city taking a cautious step. There was friction with tradesmen, for whom closure felt like starvation. "You have your stipend," a cobbler said, folding his arms. "Shall I eat air?" Thomas understood. He chose his words the way one chooses stones in a stream, broad, weighty, not meant to bruise. "I cannot argue hunger," he replied. "I can show you how to put your bench nearer the door, how to ask for coins to be set in a bowl with vinegar. I can bring you a cloth for your hands and a way to keep your tools wiped. I cannot conjure customers." The cobbler stared at him a long time, then nodded once with the reluctant grace of a man agreeing to a smaller plan when the large one has failed him. Meanwhile, the city's machinery clicked and stuttered around the work. Wardens posted bills. Criers announced new orders. Quarantine houses were marked with a sign whose exact shape changed as quickly as rumor did. A noble family petitioned for a private gate to the river. A rope seller submitted a request to move his stall because too many carts now used his corner for sorrow. Thomas found himself consulting not on fevers, but on thresholds. "How wide must a door be?" a warden asked, "for men to carry a litter without knocking shoulders?" "How far apart should 2 beds be?" asked a mother whose children had never slept alone. He answered from the small science of his day, from the larger science of care. "Wide enough for kindness," he said of the door. "As far as your hands can reach," he told the mother, "so that when you reach to touch one child, you do not warm the air of the other." Even the touch points of ordinary faith shifted under the social strain. A procession went out one morning, candles in daylight, a sorrowful beauty. And by afternoon, the wardens had ordered that prayers be said from windows, not in the square, because too many bodies poured their breathing into one bowl. The city obeyed in its sideways fashion. At vespers, 100 small flames burned in leaded panes. Voices mingled not by proximity, but by faith, that sound finds its own roads. The plague brotherhoods moved beneath that net of light like steady insects, and Thomas, passing, felt the unusual blessing of being unseen among the candles, a man whose silhouette had become too legible. He learned to recognize the faces of those who lived keenly in the city's in-between spaces. The midwife, who revised her routes to avoid crossing the Brotherhood's carts at certain hours. The bookseller, who turned his inventory into small piles on stone benches so that buyers could choose without stepping into his tiny shop. The musician, who moved his songs to the widest square and stood with his back to a wall to keep a buffer of air before him, playing tunes that had traveled by river from other cities that had known their own bad seasons. These people did not belong to any official structure and yet sustained the social fabric as surely as wardens and priests. They made a climate where Thomas's work did not feel like a solitary error. There was also the pest house at the edge of the city, a place built with good intentions and rough hands. Its windows faced the river. Its walls learned quickly where to sigh and where to hold. For the staff there, nurses quick with basins and quiet with their grief, men who kept the fires going for boiling linens. The doctor was not a symbol, but a fellow craftsperson. They asked him practical questions. Show me a slower way to change a bandage without stirring the sore. If the night is bad, how often should I change the cloth if the vinegar runs low? He, in turn, asked them what they had noticed by the bed at 3 a.m. that no book had told him. They like a lullaby, one nurse said, matter of fact, and then, catching herself as if she had trespassed into the sentimental, laughed once and added, the patient, I mean, but the fever too. It likes rhythm. Give it rhythm and it loosens its teeth a little. He did not record that in his pocketbook. He kept it in the part of his mind where the human sciences live and take root beneath the words we are allowed to write. If there was honor anywhere, it lay in the steadiness of such exchanges, not in the city's address to virtue. Now and then, a magistrate would make a round to show that the government still had a face and a hat, and he would thank Thomas and assure him that the city will remember. Thomas had lived long enough to know that cities remember differently than people do. A person remembers as a room remembers the warmth of a body. A city remembers like stone, slowly and in layers. The most reliable memory, he suspected, would be the circle of women at the fountain, the baker's hook, the apothecary's scale, the brotherhood's wash basin. Those were the places where the fear of the doctor softened, not because he had become less frightening, but because daily life had found ways to accommodate the fright without breaking. At night, when rounds were done and the city thinned to its bones, Thomas would sit by his small window, with his mask laid neatly on its cloth, and copy the day's lists into a fairer hand. He added marks of his own devising to a few names. A small star for a house that had bravely showed neighbors how to air bedding. A circle for a man who had, without being asked, held a lantern over a stairwell while the Brotherhood carried a body down. A cross, not for death, but for a decision that had spared others. Closing a shop early, moving a bench, fetching water for someone who could not fetch it herself. He understood that none of this would be asked for by the wardens. He kept it anyway. It made the city legible to him as something other than a tally of grief. Sometimes, late, there would be a knock. A priest on his way back asked for vinegar because his small supply had run thin. A Brotherhood man asked if Thomas could write a note to a magistrate to secure extra linen. The midwife asked whether the pest house needed a basin she had an extra of. Thomas gave what he could and received what was offered: a candle stub, a story, a scrap of tune, a bowl of broth left outside his door by someone who could not bring herself to speak. He began to understand that society is not only the newsletter voice of a magistrate, but the daily barter of steadiness among those nobody writes odes about. And when the moon was high, and the city's noises had arranged themselves into the slow rhythm that means we are still here, he admitted to himself what he could not say aloud, that in this social arrangement, his work was a hinge. People feared him more than they honored him, because fear comes first. Payment felt closer to penalty than to praise, because necessity is rarely generous with its tone. Beliefs curled around his beak and cane like vinework. Priest of death, jailer of air, walking omen, yet in the narrow places where hands passed bowls and notes and lanterns and the ends of prayers, he belonged, not as a savior, but as one steady presence among many, each required if the door was to open to morning. On a soft evening after rain, the bellman's staff knocked 3 patient times somewhere beyond his window. Thomas blew out his candle and sat in the warm dark, hearing the city breathe. Behind his eyelids, he saw the cobbler's set jaw, the apothecary's weighing hand, the girl by the fountain peering into the beak. He thought of the Brotherhood's quiet backs at work, the priest's quick, firm nod at a threshold, the searcher's ink-stained fingers. He thought of coin counted with reluctant care, and of the mended pot left like a shy syllable at his door. He felt, almost scholastically, the weight of the costume on his shoulders and the way it moved others to move around him. Tomorrow, he said to the room, not to command, just to measure the promise in the word. Tomorrow, he would be looked at and avoided, thanked from a distance and blamed by rumor. Tomorrow, he would be paid or not. He would be useful or not. He would be believed or not. The social weather would shift a few degrees here and there. Candles would bloom, bells would toll, and the work would remain, the quiet, repetitive intercourse of care that keeps a city from forgetting itself. In such a climate, even a feared man could learn to be ordinary in the best sense, a neighbor with a long nose and a ledger, passing steadily between doors, learning to walk like water around rock. Pull the camera back from Thomas's narrow lane until the city becomes a pattern of roofs and bells, then farther still until the centuries stack like pages seen edge on. In that widened view, the solitary figure in a beaked mask turns from a man into a hinge, awkward, necessary, on which medicine, government, and culture slowly learn to turn. What this work changed in medicine was not brilliance so much as behavior. Plague practice, for all its errors, forced a new choreography. Observe, record, return. The pocketbook in Thomas's gloved hand, addresses, dates, symptoms, outcomes, has a lineage that runs forward into line lists, case definitions, ward rounds, and charts with their tidy grids. Before great theories, there is counting. Before cures, there is showing up and writing down. City wardens who demanded lists of houses, bills posted at church doors that tallied deaths by parish, notices declaring which streets were shut. These made the raw material for something medicine would learn to call evidence. Even when the explanations were wrong, miasmas and baleful stars, corrupt airs and humoral storms. The habits were right. Gather facts, compare weeks, adjust. Protection, too, emerged as habit before it was science. The beak and waxed coat, laughable to later eyes, tragic to contemporary ones, were an early grammar of barrier and distance. Waxed cloth shed moisture. Gloves created a ritual around touch. The cane was both tool and buffer, a way to move linens and faces without hands. Vinegar basins at thresholds and open windows to sweep air along were the closest a pre-microbe world could come to ventilation protocols. The rules were inconsistent, sometimes magical in their reasoning, but they made practical sense. Separate bodies, wash what hands touch, change the air, reduce contact. Long before asepsis had a name, prudence acquired gestures. Institutions learned, too. Italian communes and maritime republics, always practical where trade was concerned, formalized measures that outlived any single outbreak. Islands near harbors became lazarettos, stone quarantines with clerks, kitchens, and rules. Ships waited at anchor for a set number of days, long enough to turn a superstition, 40 has a sacred ring, into a public health instrument. Health boards took shape, ufficiali di sanità, proto-medicati, with overlapping powers to inspect, to cordon, to requisition linen and bread. Their circulars told bakers how far to stand from buyers and innkeepers, where to place their benches. Their ledgers stitched together parish and port into a citywide nervous system. In London, generations later, the weekly bills of mortality would teach merchants and magistrates to read the city's pulse as numbers in a column. In Venice and Ragusa, earlier, quarantine rules would move from emergency edict to standing policy, as ordinary as customs dues. None of this delivered a cure, but it created a scaffold on which cures could someday stand. The idea that disease had a pattern, not a punishment alone, not a random tide, but a behavior one could watch, was strengthened every time a doctor like Thomas wrote fever on the third day, and returned to see whether a window left open mattered. The Quiet Revolution was administrative before it was anatomical. Calendars pinned to walls, maps daubed with chalk, couriers carrying orders faster than rumor could travel. Medicine would later speak of contagion and microbes, of vectors and fomites. Long before that, cities learned to act as if disease moved along streets the way water found its channels, and they tried to interrupt the flow. Fear left sediments that culture still carries. The Europe that survived repeated visitations could not help but give them shape in art and ritual. Dance of Death murals paraded popes with peasants, queens with bakers, all made equal by a bony partner who refused pride a foothold. A visual ethic for classrooms without books. Painters filled canvases with apocalyptic cavalcades, a reminder that order is conditional and time has teeth. Saints acquired new patronage. Sebastian's arrows and Roach's lifted tunic became shorthand for intercession when medicine could not help. Pilgrims left votive plaques shaped like lungs and hands. Church walls became low museums of gratitude and bargaining. Yet culture did not only memorialize terror, it domesticated it. Children's rhymes learned to tuck sorrow under melody. Festivals learned to carry a jesting version of the beaked figure, and a carnival mask, Il Medico della Peste, would grin from stalls where once officials posted grim bills. Humor, even macabre humor, is a kind of civic scar tissue, flexible enough to let life move, strong enough to hold. The smell of rosemary in kitchens, the habit of keeping a window cracked even in deep winter, the polite way Europeans learned to pass on narrow stairs shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. Such small continuities of caution lingered far beyond the season that taught them. The mask itself is a traveler between centuries, and it travels badly and well at once. Strict historians will remind us that the most recognizable beaked costume belongs more to the early modern city than to the medieval one. Popularized by court physicians and municipal doctors generations after the first great wave of plague, standardized where earlier practice had been improvisation. And yet the silhouette has been recruited by memory to stand for the whole era of pestilence. Memory is not a clerk. It is a sculptor. It condenses decades into a single outline, fuses the 14th and 17th centuries into one emblematic evening, and tells you, with that long bill and those black lenses, what it felt like to be watched by a figure who was both helper and omen. As symbol, the beak does work no footnote can. It captures the way knowledge and fear braided together, science in the herbs, superstition in the shape, practicality in the waxed seams, theater in the whole. It speaks across languages. Set that profile against any skyline, and the mind supplies bells, vinegar, tally marks, and whispered prayers. In troubled times, it resurfaces. On posters, in plays, in parades and protests, because it can be bent to many meanings. Authority with a human face hidden, care with a cost, danger walking in daylight, a plea for patience. When you see it on a museum placard or a costume shop hook, you are meeting not only a historical garment, but a vessel that has carried centuries of feeling without spilling. Across to our own era, the parallels are humbling and precise. Trade the waxed canvas for polymer, the leather bill for molded respirator, the cane for a tablet that glows with charts. The postures are recognizably kin. A modern clinician walks a ward as Thomas walked his lane, measures, records, returns. Protective equipment muffles the voice and dims the face. Gestures have to carry more of the meaning. New rituals arrange space. 6 feet, one-way arrows, negative pressure rooms, and new phrases acquire the weight of liturgy. Flatten the curve, protect the vulnerable. When supply chains knot, the masks in our time become as precious as the herbs were in his. When rumor outpaces policy, cities relearn that trust is as important to health as any instrument. We have better tools, yes, microscopes, antivirals, oxygen blades of air, the quiet genius of vaccination, the statistical courage to see a pattern early and act. But the old frictions return in familiar guises. Economic grief accents every order. Clergy and scientists, merchants and magistrates argue about assemblies and closures in tones that an older bell could accompany. Gratitude is loud in the evening, applause from balconies like a secular vespers, and then, as months lengthen, fatigue trails its shadow, and the applause fades to ordinary kindnesses, a meal left on a step, a note on a door, a mended pot. Misinformation does what rumor always did, only faster. And the people in protective dress, faces hidden, carry not only bodies and charts, but the psychic freight of being at once needed and refrained from. The previous centuries leave us then, not a manual, but a temperament. They teach that during catastrophe, the virtues that scale are often the smaller ones. The rigor of returning, the courtesy of clear words, the discipline of writing things down, even when writing feels futile. They teach that institutions matter, not only genius individuals, but the slow, stubborn machinery of boards and budgets, larders and laundries. They teach that care is contagious in the best sense. A neighbor holding a lantern, steadies a whole stairwell. A midwife altering her route is policy enacted with feet. They also teach that symbols, for better or worse, will accelerate or impede policy. If a mask becomes an emblem of menace, trust shrinks. If it becomes a badge of mutual regard, trust expands. Culture writes laws on the air long before a clerk writes them on paper. In that light, Thomas's ledger belongs on the same long shelf as the bills of mortality, and, farther along, the charts a modern hospital prints at shift change. His cane extends, in a curious way, toward the aisle markers in a grocery during an outbreak. His vinegar bowl points toward a hospital's hand rub dispenser. His open window counsel rhymes with a school nurse's talk about ventilation. The beak is nothing like an N95, and yet they share the human relief of equipment that says, I will do what I can to keep your breath from harming mine, and mine from harming yours, while we get on with the work of care. Fear's residues are not only anxious, some are protective. Architects still design light and air into public buildings with half-remembered epidemics in mind. City charters keep dusty clauses that leap to life during bad seasons, granting emergency powers to people who hope never to use them. Medical oaths have grown longer. Ethics boards more meticulous, because history taught us that panic loves shortcuts. The beaked figure, meanwhile, watches from the margins, on book covers, at festivals, in the scribbles of teenagers and the tattoos of artists, as a reminder that we have felt this before and kept going. If the symbol frightens, it also steadies. You are not the first to work while afraid. And what of the debate? Was the beak truly medieval, or early modern, masquerading backward? For the story we are telling, the answer is both academic and beside the point. The Middle Ages and the centuries that followed were not separate rooms, but adjoining chambers with a door propped open. Practices leaked through, were refined, were ritualized, were argued. The silhouette walks between them like a courier bearing an enduring message. That medicine grows by keeping company with catastrophe and refusing to let catastrophe be the only teacher. Return, finally, to the room where Thomas lays his mask on folded cloth, his ledger open to a page salted with small marks. He is a specimen from one century and a colleague to many. His work bent medicine toward method, government toward routine, culture toward symbol and song. For all the limits of his knowledge, he pushed the profession a little closer to the posture that saves, measured, patient, attentive to the living human in front of him. In our hospitals and homes, in our committees and closets, we repeat the motions in shapes more modern, but with the same quiet ambition. That fear will not have the last word. That care will not be ashamed of its small tools. That the city will learn again, slowly, stubbornly, to breathe together. When the bell sounds at evening and the lanes go soft, you can hear the echo of that ambition. A page turned, a window cracked, a mask hung by its straps to dry, a nurse counting, a clerk posting numbers, a neighbor setting bread on a sill. And somewhere, maybe close, maybe only in the mind, a long-nosed figure passes, no monster, only a worker, reminding us that history's harshest hours also teach the hands their gentlest, most exacting art. By the third month, the city had a new calendar. It was kept not by saints' days, but by the pace of bells, by the morning carts and the evening quiet. Thomas learned to read it the way a sailor reads a sky. How a day began in the tone of the street, whether shutters leaned outward to trade talk, whether the baker's hook held a loaf or only a bit of string for hope to grip. He carried his pocketbook and the small instruments that let his hands feel useful. But more and more, the satchel felt like a set of keys that did not open the doors he needed. The first crack in his practiced steadiness came in an afternoon that smelled of rain, though the rain did not arrive. He had been to 7 houses, and at each he had arranged windows and linen and words, the way a mason arranges stones around a hole the earth insists on making. At the 8th, he found Bernard again, the boy whose fever had once broken under a slick of sweat like a truce signed with a shaking hand. This time the truce had been violated. The swellings had grown hard and hot. The pulse under Thomas's glove ran like a creature cornered. The mother looked at him with an apology that had nowhere to go. "It came back," she said. And then, with a kind of deliberate bravery, "We did everything you told us. We kept the air moving. We sang when the fever climbed." Thomas answered with the words that steadied. "You did well. You are doing well." Because truth had to be salted with kindness to be bearable, and because the little boy needed his mother to hear that she had not failed him. He set the vinegar cloth. He mixed the herbs. He wrote the hour and the signs, and his hand shook once and then became obedient again. When he stepped into the alley, the city rushed up to meet him with all its ordinary sounds, the patient wheel, the careful foot. But for a long minute the world felt like a theater whose stage had sunk 2 inches and thrown all the lines into disarray. The crack widened 2 days later. A household on Griffin Lane had sent for him with a scrap of linen knotted on a broom by the door, a sign for haste. He found a father, a grandmother, and 2 children. The mother lay in the back room making a sound that wasn't moan or word, a sawed-off kind of breath. In the kitchen, a pot steamed itself into nothing because no one had remembered to lift it from the flame. Thomas did the things the Guildhall taught: air and water, poultice and patience. He spoke gently, the way his mother had counseled. He used the cane to lift a blanket edge and to touch a chin so the beak could stay a measured distance away. The swellings on the mother's body told their blunt story. The younger child's skin was too hot. The older one's eyes had the watchfulness that means a mind is counting what it cannot name. The father asked the only question that mattered. "Can you help her?" He did not say save, though the word was the one the room wanted. Thomas held the father's gaze and found the thin beam of honesty that would not break the ceiling. "I can make it easier," he said. And then, because easier is a word that needs furniture, he added, "I can cool her and open the air. I will come back at midnight and again at dawn." The father nodded, as if accepting the terms of a difficult tenancy. When Thomas returned at midnight, the house had learned the rhythm of vigil. The grandmother had a small rosary wound through her fingers, a practical way to keep her hands from picking at worry. The father stood as if he had been carved there from the doorframe itself. The children slept in crooked shapes on the bench, their mouths open to whatever mercy travels the length of a night. He set his bag down and worked in the dark, that careful way a city learns when candles burn dear. Hands finding basins by memory, ears reading breathing, a mind arranging what is possible and what must be left alone. Near dawn, the mother's breathing grew quiet in the specific way that makes a room hold itself still. The sound that had sawed became a shallow, silted river, then a hush. The father did not move. A single bird somewhere argued with the gray morning. The grandmother's fingers paused, and the beads rested as calmly as stones. Thomas stayed long enough to make the room ready for sorrow. Water on the table, a cloth folded with the dignity any face deserves. He wrote the hour, the name, the small notes that make meaning behave, and he stepped into the alley with the taste of vinegar high in his throat, as if grief had an acid of its own. His own body reminded him, sometime that week, that he was not immune to the climate he worked in. A tenderness under his arm announced itself like a secret that wanted recognition. He found a small swelling, barely the size of a pea, and circled it with ink in the mirror to see if it would grow. He told himself all the reasonable things, that men get swellings from strain, that straps chafe, that fear will crown any pimple. He drank more water. He worked. At night, he sat at his window and watched the bellman's staff knock the reassuring 3 times and felt his own pulse in his throat like a visitor at the door asking admittance. The fever, when it came like weather, the way a room warms imperceptibly until someone says aloud, "It is hot." He woke shivering and hot at once, the most unreasonable of combinations. The mask on its cloth watched him with an expression it did not have. He considered 3 options and found them all felt like betrayal. To go on rounds and risk bringing harm with him. To stay and let his ledger go empty. To send a note and ask the Brotherhood to take his houses. He did what frightened him the least. He wrote the notes. He measured the swelling, no larger than the ink circle yet. He steamed his room with vinegar and slept sitting up, as if posture could argue a fever down. By afternoon, the fever's teeth had loosened, or he had simply learned how to bear them. He went out carefully, resolved to speak from thresholds only. The city met him with the look it gave a storm cloud deciding whether to pour. He visited Bernard, whose small hand was cool with a coolness that frightened him more than heat. He visited the Griffin Lane family. The younger child had begun to cough the cough that is not a cousin to any ordinary cough. The older one had made himself a steward of cups and cloths, a child applying order like a poultice to a wound too large. The father asked no questions now. He had learned to make each hour a container for a task. Wash the railing, turn the sheet, count to 100 quietly, so the body remembers it belongs to rhythm. In the late day, when even the river makes the sound of a tired beast settling, Thomas's turning point arrived without music. He stood in a doorway, holding a basin, and knew, clear as a line scratched into glass, that he would not save these people. Not just this family, not the city in the scale that minds like to imagine. He could not keep a fever from finding its shape. He could not stay the hand that tightened his own throat in the small hours. He could not reverse time with neatness, kindness, vinegar, or notes. He could bear witness. He could keep company. He could lighten the angle at which sorrow fell. He could be precise where chaos wanted to devour specifics. That was all. And in that admission, the room, waiting for its law, found one, presence as craft. He set the basin down. He took the cane and pointed to the window, and the father opened it, and the evening came in. A thin, honest air that asked nothing. He asked for a cloth and folded it so that the fold itself dignified the act. He timed the breathing with his own, not to control it, but to make sure he didn't speak over it. And he learned how to say, "We will do this now," in a way that meant we will not be alone for this. He sent the boy to fetch water, so the boy could be competent at something when the world had given him nothing to be competent about. He spoke the woman's name to the room, because names tie people to themselves when illness tries to unstring them. He wrote what she liked to eat when she could eat, not because it would matter tomorrow, but because it mattered to the sentence, she liked to eat. And not everything in this house is a sign of sickness. The mother died at dawn, measured simply by the fact that the room no longer waited between breaths. The father moved in a small circle, as if his mind had drawn him a corral. The older boy began to scrub the table with such care that Thomas understood he was scouring the idea of helplessness itself. The younger child trembled like a string on an instrument that has been tuned too tight. Thomas stood, not to leave, but because standing was a way to make the room recalibrate around the living. He stepped to the door and met the brotherhood in the alley, and he spoke with that quiet vocabulary parish after parish had learned. Linen, lift, time, careful. He signed the paper the warden held out, his name looking both too thin and too presumptuous on a line that belonged to the dead. He did not go home. He went to the guild hall and asked for a different ledger. What kind? The clerk said, eyes too red to pretend to be neutral. Not the list of houses, Thomas said. Another, a book for particulars. The clerk frowned, then nodded, then reached under the counter and brought out a book with a cover the color of strong tea. Thomas carried it back to his room as if it were heavier than it was. That night, he began a new practice. He kept the official pocketbook, the addresses, the signs, the hours, because the city needed it. And beside it, he wrote the unrequested entries that turned a tally into a testimony. Bernard likes the story about the miller and the clever fox. Father on Griffin Lane. Hands of a mason. Traces mortar at his nails even now. Mother sang off key, but the little one's head turned toward the sound like a plant toward light. He recorded the small excellences. A neighbor who held a lantern steady for 30 minutes without her arm dropping. A searcher who remembered to ask if the cat needed water. A priest whose voice didn't climb into alarm when the older boy asked whether God would be angry at him for falling asleep, holding his mother's hand. He added a front page to the book, a quiet declaration of purpose written in the careful hand he used for recipes. Things worth being exact about when exactness is all the mercy left. It was not medicine in the heroic sense. It did not change a pulse, but it changed the quality of hours, which is a way of shifting the weight of a life without pretending to move the mountain. Word of the new book walked faster than he did. A brotherhood man knocked one evening and said, not quite sheepish, put this in, if you will, that the old woman on Fisher's Row asked us to carry her husband through the narrow door feet first so he could look as if he were going to work, like always. A midwife brought a name on a scrap and said she wanted it spelled right. The apothecary sent a note with a parcel. Write that the widow who comes for comfort leaves half for her neighbor. If the city forgets, the book won't. The book became a modest magnet for the kind of detail civic memory rarely has room for, as if the city, hearing it, would be held wrinkled and whole, offered up the wrinkles without shame. Thomas still kept his rounds, still washed his hands until the skin at the knuckles became a map of small rivers, still had nights where the fever made its pale claim and then withdrew. He still failed in the largest sense, because the season had its own arithmetic, but he did not fail in the sense that had revealed itself that dawn, the sense of company, of measure, of liturgy without incense. He learned to speak last words forward. I will return at midnight. Turn the sheet then. Wet the lips with the spoon if she is dry. Put the window to the wind. He learned to turn blame aside when it sought a home, to give it a task instead. He learned to pass from room to room like a metronome the city had wound up and depended upon to keep time when time refused to be civil. He returned to Bernard one evening when the light was the color of old paper. The boy was awake and quiet. The mother sat by the bed with a posture that made breathing look like work to be done steadily. Thomas knew, before he counted or peered or wrote, what the night would ask. He sat, the beak and arc over the bedside world, and he told Bernard the fox story, not as well as the mother did, but with the reliable beats a child can step on. He taught the father how to count breaths without making them duties. He opened the window to let the evening strop itself thin against the sill and bring its faint comfort of iron and river. When the moment came, it came simply, and the room's geometry changed in that practiced way. 3 people leaning toward one who is no longer there, then leaning toward one another. After, Thomas wrote the hour and the particulars. Bernard listened with wide eyes, closed them halfway through the clever part. He folded the paper and left it with the mother, who did not read it then, but held it like a stone warmed at a fire. He stepped into the lane and found that the bells had fallen quiet for a rare minute, as if the city had given up counting for the length of one breath. In the hush, he understood that the ledger he had begun would not only be history's small kindness, it would be a way to make his own life larger than the sum of doors he could not open. Thus, the resolution took its calm shape. He accepted that his role was not to win in a contest medicine could not yet enter, but to write, to witness, to keep method when despair begged for spectacle. He became a man who moved along the seam between private loss and public record with a needle in his hand. He taught younger searchers to draw a simple map of a house before they went in so they could move more quietly. He asked the wardens to post a bill with plain, short sentences instead of a river of clauses. He answered questions in the square in a voice travelers use to sell plums, low, even, kind to the nouns. He insisted, when he could, on the dignity of particulars, that names be written, that candles at windows be counted as participation and not defiance, that the beak not be mocked in the hearing of children, because children were keeping their own ledgers. He visited the Griffin Lane family until the story reached its hard terminus, and then stayed 1 hour more so that the room would not learn to equate doors closing with loneliness. He sat with the father on the step and did not try to explain the unexplainable. He let the man tell him about mortar, about how a wall holds if you expect it to lean sometimes and build for that lean. He wrote that into the book too, because medicine also learns from masons. The swelling under his arm receded. Perhaps it had never been the worst kind. Perhaps he had been spared by luck, or by the small prudence of his gestures, or by a body's mysterious negotiations. He did not claim a miracle. He claimed a task. He rose. He walked. He knocked. He recorded. He was no longer walking toward victory. He was walking toward fidelity. The city, in its slow way, recognized the exchange. The innkeep left the bench by the door, but put a better mug on it. The children called him Master Ledger once, and ran, not in mockery, but in the way children taste new titles like fruit. The bellman paused one night, and without speaking, showed him the deep nick in his staff, where a nail had caught it. He ran his thumb along it, and nodded as if to say, "We are all keeping count in our ways." On a late evening, when the river sounded like cloth being shaken gently, Thomas closed his book and laid his pen on its spine. He handled the mask as he always did, with the small courtesy of setting it just so, as if it were a partner who had carried the day's weight without complaint. The city's noises had arranged themselves into their night pattern: the broom sift, the distant cart, a laugh held and then released, the bell's patient measure. He understood, without proclamation, that his work had found its name. Not savior, not even healer in the way a storybook wants, but chronicler and companion. He would be remembered, if remembered, as the man who wrote while others grieved, who stood still when rooms tried to slide away, who turned rumor into rows of words small enough to carry. It was enough. Enough for him to place his hand on the book's cover and feel, like a steadying pulse, the pages within. Names, hours, traits, the small furniture of lives, and to trust that when this season had passed into another season's archive, the shape of his care would still be legible. Enough to know that if a future reader traced the lines, they would not only see the numbers cities use to govern themselves, they would hear the hum of a lullaby, smell rosemary and vinegar, feel the cool of stone and the warm insistence of cloth, and recognize in the beaked silhouette not only fear, but work. And work, when it is faithful, outlasts terror. He trimmed the candle. He wrote a last small note to himself for morning. Bring more paper to Griffin Lane. Teach the boy the slower knot, because morning would come, even if darker than most, and the practice of expecting it was part of the craft. Then he rested his hands, not in triumph, not in defeat, but in the middle place where human beings stand when they keep watch. There is a certain kind of courage that never learns its own name. It steps into a room, sets down a basin, lifts a window latch, and lets the air move. It does not own the hour and does not promise a future. It simply refuses to abandon the present. In every century, there have been people who keep this kind of company with trouble. They do not come to conquer it. Most days cannot be conquered, but to steady the table, to fetch water, to count a pulse without flinching. Their tools change. Their posture does not. Thomas, our beaked figure, belongs to that long, unadorned tradition. His ledger mattered because it made the world behave for a few minutes at a time, lining grief up with words so it could be carried by human hands. He learned the work's scale, not victory, not even rescue most days, but fidelity. You might call it caretaking, or witness, or simply attention, the smallest unit of compassion, paid out again and again. What remains after such hours? Not triumphal arches, not the kind of stories that end with the city lifted on a single pair of shoulders. What remains are practices that feel like manners because they are. Speak gently. Return when you say you will. Make room for light and air. Write things down so memory does not bruise itself, trying to recall what matters. These habits are modest enough to pass unnoticed, yet they form a hinge on which whole neighborhoods turn. In the thick of fear, they are the only promises that can be kept without bitterness. Even in the harshest weeks, a second economy moves alongside coin, the barter of steadiness. A lantern held at a stairwell, broth left outside a door, a story told in a voice that keeps its evenness when evenness is scarce. Such exchanges do not erase loss. They do something more honest. They domesticate it. If grief must live among us, these gestures teach it how to behave, where to sit, how to speak in a room already crowded with other needs. The effort is quiet, but in the quiet, you can hear the old world continue to breathe. 2. The thread that does not break time, like a river, forgets its own beginning and cannot preview its mouth. but it knows how to carry sediments. Across centuries, certain shapes refuse to dissolve. The plague doctor's mask is one. To the strict historian, it belongs more properly to later outbreaks than to the earliest medieval years. Yet memory, impatient sculptor that it is, adopted the silhouette as a shorthand for whole generations of dread and diligence. We see the curve of that beak and understand something wordless. Knowledge groping its way forward. Fear giving knowledge a costume. Community granting the costume authority because something had to be believed in while it worked. What does such a symbol keep reminding us? That life is thin and strong at once, like blown glass. That breath is a civic asset, shared whether we like it or not. That care often arrives looking inconvenient, even alarming, and that the line between omen and helper, between superstition and method, is sometimes not a line at all, but a braid. The herbs in the beak were not filtration as we understand it, yet the mask rehearsed the grammar of barriers and distance we would refine later. Waxed seams were not proof against a microbe unseen, yet the gesture leaned toward cleanliness, toward respect for the spaces between bodies. Posture became prelude to knowledge. Epidemics recede, as seasons do. They leave behind artifacts, policies, and ways of speaking. They also leave a temperament, patience with partial answers, impatience with spectacle, reverence for particulars. That temperament is not glamorous. It is evening work. It is a candle trimmed while others sleep, a ledger balanced by careful hands, a bowl rinsed and set to dry because someone will need it again tomorrow. It is the simple admission that the human project, staying, helping, showing up, does not expire when certainty does. Walk forward in the centuries, and the kinship is easy to trace. A nurse in a clear mask, a clinician in tired shoes, a clerk posting numbers no one wants to read. Each is an heir to Thomas's posture. The tools glare stainless now. The books glow with backlit graphs. The orders travel without paper. Yet the enduring instrument is still a person in a doorway, speaking steadily, arranging air and time so that fear does not fill every chair. We do not need the past to flatter us. We need it to tell us we are not improvising the whole world from scratch. The thread is old and holds. 3. A city at rest and a mask behind glass. Imagine, at last, a city that has outlived its bad season. The bells regain their ordinary cadence. The market resumes its quarrels about price and quality. The river goes back to telling time in the splash of oars. You can hear, in that return to ordinary, the faint aftersound of vigilance. Doors that still open a little wider to let air pass. Windows that remember how to lean into breeze. Hands that reach for basins almost without thinking. Habits linger where sermons fade. Somewhere in such a city, a museum keeps a room that smells faintly of dust and wool. The light is patient there, filtered through linen blinds, motes turning lazily like slow snow. In a glass case rests the mask, leather dried to a deep, comfortable brown, the beak longer than memory insists, the lenses clouded where a lifetime of breath touched them from within. A card in a tidy hand declares provenance and date, explains the beak's herbs, says something about miasma and the ambitions of public health. A school group passes, and a child leans close until her reflection swims in the convex glass. For a moment, she and the mask look at one another and recognize, perhaps without language, that fear and care can share a face. You stand a little way back. It is not reverence that keeps you there so much as appropriateness. The object has already been asked to bear too many emotions to carry yours up close as well. You imagine the hands that fastened those straps, the grain of the glove where a pencil rested, the heat of a street in high summer when vinegar dries too fast to be useful. You imagine the ledger beside it on some other shelf, names, hours, small excellences, because every tool wants its companion. The case does its duty. The room keeps its quiet. Outside, a bus sighs. A bicycle ticks as it cools. The living world persists in its acoustics. Walk out when you like. The afternoon will be ordinary in the generous way ordinary can be. A woman will haggle for peaches. A builder will hold his palm to a wall and feel whether it has set. Someone will laugh too loudly on a corner, and someone else will forgive the volume. The wind will turn a degree and carry a faint sweetness from a bakery whose ovens have their own calendar and do not consult fear. Somewhere, a clinician will chart a temperature. Somewhere, a searcher by another name will knock and ask a courteous question. Somewhere, a clerk will file a line of numbers that no one will frame, but that will keep a city honest about itself. And the mask will remain behind its glass, a quiet witness under a quiet light, not a monster at all. Its lesson is neither despair nor bravado. It says, this was our best guess once, and it helped, not enough, not always, but it helped to organize courage. It says, people showed up. It says, when knowledge lagged, manners carried us, opening, washing, returning, writing, holding a lantern steady while others passed. It says, the most faithful work is rarely dramatic, and that is why it survives drama. Evening gathers. The day thins to its transparent edge. Somewhere, the last bell of the hour takes its time crossing the roofs. The city's breath evens. In a narrow lane, broom bristles whisper as a step is swept for tomorrow. A cat negotiates a fence with democratic grace. A window, no longer needed as a shield, stays open simply because the air is pleasant. If you listen closely, past the traffic and the small debates of swallows, you can almost hear another sound. The soft rasp of a page turned in a room where someone is still keeping a ledger, still arranging the world into words gentle enough to bear. That is where we leave Thomas. Not in victory, not in the moment of dying, but in the practice that outlasts both. A man lays a mask on folded cloth. A hand rests a moment on a book's cover. A city, bearing its scars like honest ornaments, prepares for another ordinary day. The wind moves through the streets with its old, clean purpose, and the past, satisfied that it has done its portion of the work, steps back into its proper distance, leaving us with what it always meant to leave: a way to stand, a way to speak, a way to go on. In the last light of the evening, the city gathers itself into softer shapes. Roof lines mellow, cobbles lose their edges, and windows hold their small, steady fires. Down one remembered lane, a black figure with a beaked mask pauses as if listening. Once, that outline stiffened every back it passed. Now it belongs to our memory more than to our fear. We see the coat again, wax-dulled and serviceable. The lenses, clouded by breath that once warmed them from within. The cane that tapped time through rooms where time refused to be kind. We know the weight of that image in our bones. It has walked through paintings and parades, through the margins of old bills and the glass of museum cases, until it ceased to be menace and became a signpost. Not danger here, but someone stood here and did the work available. If you listen, the old acoustics return for a moment. The bell that marked a day's intake of sorrow. The wheel coaxed around a tight corner. the quiet instruction of hands rinsed in vinegar. They arrive like echoes in a shell, close, then gone, leaving only the outline of their curve. It is enough. Memory is a lantern. It does not need to be ablaze. The figure turns, just a fraction, and we are allowed to imagine the face we cannot see. Not heroic, not sainted, only set in the careful expression of someone measuring out steadiness in small, exact doses. This is what the mask holds for us now. It does not summon panic. It summons a posture, the simple, transferable discipline of showing up, speaking gently, returning when promised, arranging air and time so that life has room to keep being itself. The streets are quiet. A cat practices the democracy of fences. Somewhere, a broom completes its evening square and leans with the contentment of a finished task. A clerk closes a ledger in which numbers have earned their dignity by keeping a city honest. A nurse, by another name and in another century, lowers her hand from a light and lets the room have darkness again, because rest is also part of care. The chain is unbroken. Beak to visor, cane to chart, vinegar bowl to dispenser at a doorway. We inherit the method, and with it, the manners. So let the mask rest behind its glass, and let the lane return to what lanes do. Carry footsteps, harbor whispers, point the wind from door to door. Let the bells keep ordinary hours. Let rosemary be a kitchen herb again. The figure in black recedes along the wall until it is only a neat shadow, and then a story, and then the comfortable knowledge that when it mattered, someone stayed at the threshold and kept count kindly. We give the era back to itself with thanks. Thanks not for a victory it could not grant, but for the craft it taught and the temper it left us. In that gratitude, the beaked silhouette is no longer an omen, but a bookmark, a reminder saved between pages so the reader will not lose the line about courage's quiet grammar. And so we part with the century of vinegar and bells in the tone it deserves, measured, grateful, unafraid. The mask does not frighten in this light. It blesses by example. It points not to endings, but to continuance. The long civic habit of caring in the exact place where you stand. Among the shadows, the past still offers. We keep one clear sentence for our own use and for those who will come after. And among the shadows of the past, this mask reminds us not of death, but of those who, despite everything, did not turn away from people.